10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 339. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 339 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. This week we are going to continue our series on blues with the masters. And this week we're going to look at a trombone player. This one was a suggestion from one of our listeners, John. And John, I want to thank you for this suggestion because you are absolutely right. We're going to look at the great trombonist Jack Teagarden and his solo on the Wolverine Blues, and man, is this an absolutely incredible solo, and it's going to give us a chance to talk about some different things, a different blues form along with his wonderful playing. But before we jump into the show, just wanted to remind you this is a listener-supported podcast, which means we rely on listeners just like you to keep us going in the form of a small monthly donation, and for that you will get a PDF and audio examples to every single episode. And the way that you can join up is through the Patreon platform. You can find that by going to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, getting yourself signed up for instant access to all those materials. Quick shout out to some new patrons this week. Thank you to our two new $5 patrons, JP and Philip. Thank you so much for joining up and becoming a part of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson family, making sure that these episodes keep coming at you week in and week out with high quality. And if you are somebody that would like to join up, again, you can go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today. And thank you to everybody over there that is supporting us. We really appreciate it, and we could not do this without you. All right, so let's dive into some more blues. And as I mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at the great Jack Teagarden. Now, if you're not familiar with Jack Teagarden, you should be. He is truly one of the greatest trombonists and musicians who ever lived. His career was mostly pre-bebop. So this week we're looking at a little bit more of the traditional style. And again, if you're not familiar with this musician, did you know that he played with Louis Armstrong, Pee Wee Russell, Benny Goodman, Bix Beiderbecke, all of these names, Glenn Miller? He was on a ton of recordings. And not only was he a great and influential and forward-thinking trombonist, he was also an excellent vocalist as well. So Jack Teagarden is truly one of the American treasures of jazz. And I think we owe it to him to give him a little bit of time on this podcast because he does have a lot to teach us. And he has contributed greatly to the tradition of jazz. And again, I want to thank John, one of our faithful listeners, for bringing up that name, because when I saw it, yes, we should definitely do an episode on Jack Teagarden. So we're going to be taking a look at his solo on the Wolverine Blues. And I actually transcribed this off of a video of him and his sextet, and I will throw that link in the description on the website so that you can go and check it out. But it happens right at the end of the tune, and it's a full chorus. And on top of his solo being incredible, the Wolverine Blues is really interesting because it is not what we normally discuss on this podcast, which typically we talk about the 12-bar blues. And this tune is actually a 32-bar form that is quite a departure from the 12-bar blues that we normally talk about. So we have to put this in historical context. You know, before bebop, the jazz bands that were out there playing would play all these different forms of the blues. And yes, many of them were 12 bars, but the blues was such a prominent music and it was featured so heavily in jazz that these musicians and composers came up with many, many different ways of writing these forms that revolved around that traditional 12-bar blues. And this is a great example of it. So if we rip apart the chords, which we're gonna do a little bit, what we will see is that it basically contains the elements of a 12-bar blues, but it does it in a very, very different way, and it's laid out in a very different way. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. In fact, why don't we talk about that first? Let's go over the chords to Wolverine Blues and discover some of the similarities and differences with the 12-bar blues form. So, as I mentioned, it's a 32 bar form, and I think about it as two sections, a big A and a big B. So those would be 16 bars each. Now, it is in the key of B flat concert. So let's start going over some of these chords. So in the first four measures, what we see is 1, and then we have a sharp 1 diminished. That leads us to 5 for 2 bars. And then we see that exact same progression. 1, sharp 1 diminished to 5. Now what we see in bar 9 is we see the 1 chord becoming the 5 of the 4. So we get 2 bars of this 5 of 4, and then we go to the 4. And that takes us all the way to the end of measure 12. And then for the next 4 bars, rounding out our A section, we see a 5 of 5 for 2 bars, and then a 5 for 2 bars. So that's our A section, all right? It's all kind of 1s and 4s and 5s, and then we have that little turnaround built into the end of it that's going to bring us into the B section. So now let's go over the B section, which things do change a little bit. So we go back to our 1 chord in bar 17. We do that sharp 1 diminished passing to 5. Now, instead of doing that again, we see the 5 of 4, and then we go to 4. Then, this is a really, really common thing to do from music of this era, we go to the minor 4 for 2 bars, then we come back to 1, and then we have a turnaround. So we go 1, 6, 5 of 5, 5, back to 1. And there it is, our 32 bars. So a great and interesting chord progression. Now let's talk about some of the similarities that we see here with the 12 bar blues. So first of all, let's sort of like round up all of the chords that we're dealing with here, and let's put them in a bucket. So we have a 1 chord, which every tune has, right? And then we have the chords that are related to 1. So we have the 6 chord, the 5 of 5, and the 5, which is really important, right? Because that is basically our home key, and then the chords that are going to get us back to our home key. Now, the chords we have related to the 4, which is the other major key center, just like the blues, we have the 5 of 4. Of course, we have the 4 chord. And then the kind of outlier chords that we have here are the sharp 1 diminished, which is really just a passing chord to get us from 1 to 5, just an interesting chord to get us from that 1 to 5 rather than going directly from one to the other. And then we have that minor 4, which is really bringing us back to the key of B flat. So you see, if you think about the blues, really, what are the major things that are happening? It's going from 1 to 4, and then we are turning back around and coming to 1 by way of a turnaround, which is 6, 2, 5, 1. This one just happens to be a little bit more traditional, where it's 6, 5 of 5, 1. So you see, it has all the same elements, it's just a little bit more spread out, and it's not 12 measures. And I think it's really important to realize that in order to call something a blues, it doesn't have to be a 12-bar traditional blues form. If you start to dig into this traditional jazz a little bit more, every other tune is called the something blues, and it's not always a 12-bar form. So hopefully you could get something out of that, and hopefully it opens your mind a little bit to using the term blues. It doesn't have to be so black and white. It's either a 12-bar blues form or it's not. There's a lot of different things we can do with this blues. Okay, so now I want to jump into the solo a little bit and see what makes it so great. So let's check out what his solo sounds like over this form that we just talked about, and then we'll chat about it for a minute. What an incredible solo. And of course, you've got to go listen to Jack Teagarden play it, because I am not doing it justice. I can't play the solo on this due to copyright concerns, but you've got to go and listen to the original because it is just awesome. It's some of the bounciest time that I have ever heard. And that's one of the main things that I take away from this solo is Jack's time feel and just how bouncy and fun and joyful it is. But here's the other thing that I'm really going to take away from this solo is his combination of vertical and horizontal playing. So there's actually a ton of chromaticism in this solo. It is absolutely all over the place. But then the other thing that I notice is that there's a lot of arpeggios happening in this piece as well. So there's this really beautiful combination of really close intervals, chromaticism, chromatic lines, and also these lines that use really, really wide intervals and outline arpeggios. And if you want to talk about a master of combining those two things, look no further than this particular solo. Of course, there's also this incredible rhythmic variety that's built into it. Look at the combinations of rhythms that he's using. We've got quarter notes, eighth notes, we've got eighth note triplets, we've got this really, really interesting syncopation happening. And I always say it when we look at these more traditional solos, this really goes to show you that you do not have to play super out to put together a fantastic solo. And the older I get and the deeper I get into this music, the more I look back, right? The further I look back, and the more I feel like I can learn from these musicians where their time was before bebop. And the more I realized that actually influenced bebop, and without these musicians such as Jack Teagarden, bebop wouldn't exist. These were really some of the pioneers of jazz, and Jack really fits into that. So I want you to look at three things when you're studying this solo. I want you to find everywhere where he's using an arpeggio or more vertical style of playing. And then I want you to find everywhere where he's using chromaticism in more of a horizontal style. I want you to see how he combines those two very, very different ways of playing into this very, very seamless way of putting together phrases. And then, of course, like we always do, I really want you to look at the rhythmic scheme. See where he's playing, more importantly, see where he's not playing, and see if you can latch on to some of the ways that he's using rhythm to create a great solo. Another thing that you could think about is how is he making it this compelling without using a lot of tension, right? There's no chord substitutions in this. There's no use of diminished dominant. There's no triad pairs, anything like that. But I think we can all agree that this is just a ridiculously amazing solo. So thanks again for the suggestion on this, and I hope you got something out of this episode. Let me know if you have any questions. Remember, you can grab the PDF in B-flat, E-flat, concert, and bass clef by signing up to be a patron, and you could do that by going to 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, and getting yourself signed up today. Hope you all enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next week with another one. Have a good one, everybody. Bye.